Good afternoon, Mr. McKechnie. Now, Mr. McLaren.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. McKechnie, you'll recall, I hope, before lunch we were looking at the comments made by the board on the environmental matrix.
Yes.
In October 2014, and the response from IHSL. The responses, we maybe don't need to look at the document, but the responses that were on the right-hand column of that, were they prepared by you or your team in response to the board's comments?
I would say that they certainly be responded to them, but there'll be possibly an influence from Multiplex and IHSL on the actual wording, but the gist of it would have been from ourselves.
Yeah, so the technical gist of the responses, would that have been driven by Wallace Whittle?
Yeah.
And in response to those board comments, did you or Wallace Whittle prepare a revised version of the environmental matrix?
We did, yes.
And if we could bring up on screen, please, Bundle 4 document, Bundle 4, page 220. And whilst there's nothing on that page to tell us this, the inventory tells us that this is an environmental matrix that was issued on the 31st of October 2014, so about a week or so after those comments.
Right.
And we see on this version that previous versions of the environmental matrix had a Hulley and Kirkwood logo on it, and this version doesn't have one. Was that one of the things that Wallace Whittle did around that time? Yes,
that was the main thing that we did. Was rebadged it.
And why was that done?
Well, if it was a document that was going to come from ourselves, then it would have had our own identification on it, not Hulley and Kirkwood.
And we see this document here doesn't carry a Wallace Whittle logo or reference or anything like that.
Yeah.
Is there any significance in that?
None whatsoever, no.
And what you say in your statement, and the reference is to paragraph 9 of your statement, which is page 413 of Bundle 13. You say there that once the bidder, IHSL and Multiplex, had ownership of the environmental matrix, then we were instructed to take it on board, not to revamp it. Who was it that gave you that instruction?
Yeah, maybe not worded that as well as I could have. I don't think there was a formal instruction. There was an agreement between ourselves and Multiplex that we would take it on board as it stood.
Okay, so the idea of taking the matrix on board and not revamping it, that was something agreed between Wallace Whittle and Multiplex?
Absolutely, yes.
Are you aware of whether that emanated in any way from the board, or had that arisen on the bidder side of things?
I'm not aware of that from direct discussion. I'm only aware that what I was told was that the board were wishing IHSL to take ownership of the environmental matrix. And this was the process of taking on board that ownership.
Okay, and if we go back to Bundle 4, page 221, please. This is the page of guidance. Again, if we could just expand that text so that it's readable, please. And if we could, that's right, that's fine, thank you. And we see here the guidance notes from that version of the matrix prepared by Wallace Whittle at the end of October. And if we could scroll down, please, so we can see guidance note 26, please. If you're able to read the text, Mr. McKechnie, could you please just take a moment to read guidance note 26 and let me know once you've done that?
Yeah. Yes, I'm aware. I'm aware of the contents of that note.
And so Was that a new guidance note inserted by Wallace Whittle?
It was as a result of the review which had been held on the single bed ventilation strategy and the outcome of that review.
So was this in response to one of the points that the board had raised in that note that we looked at before lunch of comments?
Yes, it was directly in response to the 4 versus 6 air change.
And can you just explain what the note means, please?
Okay, well, essentially, after that comment on the environmental matrix, we were requested to provide I can't recall whether it was a report in the first instance, but it certainly culminated in a presentation to the board of the options which are available to them for the single bed ventilation strategy. That presentation took place and we agreed, or the agreement, in my opinion, was that the agreement was that rather than have the positive, marginally positive pressure within the single bedrooms, that we would achieve a balance between the amount of air that was supplied in and the amount of air that was being extracted via the bathrooms in the rooms. And that is what that note there is intended to record.
Okay, so if we just keep that document on screen, and I'll refer back to the note from October of the board's comments, and it was the one that we looked at this morning. It raised a couple of queries. One was whether it should be 4 air changes or 6 air changes.
Yeah.
And the other one was whether the bedrooms should have a positive pressure arrangement relative to the corridor or balanced or negative.
Yeah.
And this, you're saying this note was added by Wallace Whittle in response to that query being raised?
Not directly in response to the query. It was added after, in response to the query, we were asked to and gave a presentation to the board, particularly to infection protection, to present to them the options that they had. So, in essence, we played back to them what the result of what they had briefed in their environmental matrix would be. The infection control's concern at the time was that if you had a positive pressure within the bedroom, then that air would spill into the corridor. Thus, someone in the corridor potentially got contaminated air, let's call it, from the single bedroom. That we discussed with them how we could, as engineers, how we could change that strategy if they so wished. And what came out of that discussion was exactly what's on that note there, where we balanced the extraction coming away from the room with the supply air that was going in, so that in effect they had a balanced system within the rooms. So in essence, I was playing back their own briefing to them, which the inference was that wasn't their then current, I don't know how it arrived at it first of all, but it wasn't their then current requirement. And the discussion was more, in fact, it was almost entirely on the pressure regime as opposed to the amount of air changes.
Okay, there's quite a lot of information in there. And so what I'm going to try and do is just put it in order as I've understood it and just check with you whether the understanding is correct.
Yeah, right.
So is it correct that in the environmental matrix issued by the board with the tender documents, the requirement was for positive pressure in the single bedrooms?
Yes.
And the board comments made at the end of October included a concern about having a positive pressure arrangement in the single bedrooms.
Yep.
And as you understood it, that was driven by concerns about the spread of infection.
That was what was discussed at the meeting, yes.
And as the board's comment indicates they referred to the SHTM guidance as indicating that the pressure balance shouldn't be positive, but should be balanced or negative.
Yes, again on the guidance. Yep.
And ultimately, that ended up with Wallace Whittle adding that note to the environmental matrix.
It also entailed us increasing the extraction that was getting taken from the rooms to a higher figure to allow the balance to be achieved.
Okay, so
the board also queried the number of air changes within the bathrooms, which they, in the same thing, which was 3 air changes from the SHTM. Hullies, or whoever had prepared the environmental matrix, had lifted that to 10, and we explained that we thought that was the right thing to do, as 10 was more akin to a commercial hotel-style bathroom, and that 3 was a particularly low extraction rate, particularly when it was a single occupancy. So there was a lot of discussion round about the whole setup and the single bedrooms.
Okay, if we maybe try and just separate those issues out, the board had raised this concern, an infection-driven concern, about positive pressure.
Pressure, yes.
Between single bedrooms and the corridor.
Yes.
And based on their interpretation of the guidance, had sought a negative or balanced pressure arrangement for those rooms.
Yes.
And one of the purposes of the guidance note that you added in was to establish that the pressure arrangement for single bedrooms should be balanced.
It was to record that that was a design strategy that we were adopting.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned a separate point there, which was the environmental matrix issued by the board with the tender documents required 10 air changes per hour from the ensuite bathrooms.
Yes.
I think you were saying it had been identified that that was in excess of the recommended rate of 3.
Yep.
Yeah. And again, I'm just replaying back what I've understood you to say, so don't let me put words in your mouth. Your view at the time was, whilst that was a departure from SHTM 0301, it was actually a higher standard and one that made sense.
Exactly that, for purposes of patient dignity, etc. Then yes, it made sense to have it the higher figure.
Now, again, your comment there, your guidance note 26 that we see at the bottom of the page, headed up single bedrooms, it doesn't specify any particular department. Did you understand the guidance note to relate to all single bedrooms in the hospital, whatever department they were in?
Yes, there was no separate discussion on or delineation of on a departmental basis of what we were speaking about.
And if we look up to guidance note 15 above, you recall this morning that when we looked at guidance note 15 in the earlier version of the environmental matrix, we had a look at comments made there about humidification.
Yeah.
And do we see here that there are still comments about humidification in the HDU critical care areas, but the comment is different from the previous version?
Correct, because it takes on board the response that we got after querying it, because the original one would have had the provision of a humidifier, which is quite a costly piece of equipment and it's quite complicated, and it's not normally recommended, except the exception to that being what's normally recommended is, look, don't supply it day one, but leave it as a potential retrofit. And that's what we've captured on that note.
Okay, so Wallace Whittle, in this reissue of the environmental matrix, have made a change to the guidance note to reflect the clarification.
The discussions that we'd had up to that point.
Okay. Do we see in guidance note 15, again in the high dependency and critical care areas, there's a reference in there to SHTM 0301, Appendix 1, and its recommendation of 10 air changes per hour.
Yeah.
What rooms or areas did you understand that figure of 10 air changes per hour to relate to?
My understanding was that figure related to isolation rooms. And it was, at that point in time, we hadn't addressed it, but we did address that in later issues of the environmental matrix.
And why didn't you address it in this issue of the environmental matrix?
It hadn't really been discussed to any degree that I can remember. It was something which, on our ongoing review of the matrix, it became apparent that wasn't a comfortable note for us. Hence because although it says 10 air changes, there's no mention of the pressure. So it then became to our mind, it became a note that had to be better clarified.
I mean, you said earlier, as I've understood it, that during the competitive dialogue phase, you checked the key parameters of the environmental matrix.
Yes.
Did these key parameters that you checked include the guidance notes in the matrix?
Yes, it would have.
So during that checking period, was the reference here to 10 air changes per hour something that you noticed and gave thought to?
If we had particularly noticed it, and again bearing in mind that we hadn't got down to the sleeves up and the nuts and bolts of the actual design, which followed on, then we would have flagged it up. The 10 air change by itself didn't ring any warning bells to us. It just seemed a poorly phrased. I'm sorry, I'll correct that. I don't think we actually even thought it was poorly phrased at the time. It just didn't really. It wasn't abnormal to us because we'd still had to go into each of these departments in detail.
And just to be clear about it, you say that you understood the references to 10 air changes in these guidance notes to refer to isolation rooms. Why did you say you understood it to relate to isolation rooms?
Because that's the only rooms which we would expect would have, apart from, I think there's one other room, which is a treatment room. It's the only rooms where the 10 air change or rate would resonate. And
was that view based on the way that you construed SHTM 0301 at the time?
It's based on our experience and on the actual figures which are contained within SHTM 0301.
Okay, if we could move forward to page 222, please. Now, we see here a page that's headed up Room Function Reference Sheet.
Yes.
The inquiry has had an explanation from other witnesses about how this worked, but what was your understanding of the function of this sheet?
The function of that sheet was to identify common repeatable rooms and which then allows you to pick a particular room, for example, a bathroom or a bedroom, which is the first two on there, complete the 20 plus rows on the sheet, and then apply that as a standard to the bathrooms and bedrooms in the various departments, such that you've captured the standard that remains the same throughout those departments, and should help to reduce the amount of compilation, because you're talking about, I don't know, 40 rooms at 20 odd, as opposed to 50,000 of them. So that helps take that 50,000 number way down, so that you reduce the compilation.
And so this sheet and that function derived from the work done by Hulley and Kirkwood.
Yes, this methodology had been put forward by Alan Kirkwood, and I adopted it because it seemed a sensible thing to do. The only thing I take exception to is the titling of room function. I don't think that's a very good title because it tends to infer a clinical function, but that's not what this is. This is simply engineering.
Just to explore that, for example, if we look down the list of room functions in the leftmost column, we've got various things that appear there, including, diagnostic room, ward kitchen, laboratory, multi-bed wards, so on.
Mm-hmm.
Do those not reflect different clinical uses?
Not unless we're briefed. So unless someone had indicated that one of those areas you've just spoken about had to be treated separately, and that would have to have been a direction from either I would suggest from the client, from whatever base he had, then those rooms would all tend to have the same solutions applied to them.
And you said you adopted it because you thought it looked like a helpful thing. Does that remain your view in hindsight?
It does, yes.
Now, down that list of room functions in the leftmost column, if you look down it, you'll see that there's no entry there for HDU, but we don't need to bring it up on screen, but the version circulated by the board with the tender documents did have an entry for HDU.
Yeah.
And you explain in your statement that that was a Wallace-Whittle decision to remove that.
It's because it did not appear to be a repeatable room.
So that was a change made not in response to a comment from the board, but something that Wallace-Whittle decided to do.
It was, well, as we were taking ownership of it, if we saw something which could be tidied up, let's call it, then we would apply that.
So HDU was taken out of the room function reference sheet, but the guidance note that we looked at a moment ago, which referred to particular design criteria for HDU, that was left in place?
Yes.
Why was that?
That was left in place on the basis that it's not for our interpretation of that term HDU would have been the isolation rooms. So I don't have the isolation rooms on here, primarily because they are cross-referenced to SHPN 04. But the high dependency unit would tend to suggest to me that it was an isolation room.
I'm not sure I quite follow why, if you thought it necessary to remove HDU from this sheet in front of us, it didn't follow that you would also remove it from the guidance notes.
It was simply because on the left-hand side, it refers to the room function, and on the left-hand column of the environmental matrix, there are a number of room titles. HDU didn't feature on the room titles. Therefore, we didn't think it was correct to have HDU as a repeatable room function when there wasn't one designated as such. So we took it away.
But the board had gone to the extent of including a guidance note that specifically referred to HDU. Did that not strike you as odd if the room function of HDU was not to be used?
Not particularly, because with the hindsight looking at that note, I think it's the note is not very clear as to what they are covering with on what they term HDUs.
You mean
we
the
had
guidance
this debate
note?
before about the is it the whole of the critical care area, which doesn't really stack up. So again, where we could, we were trying to bring clarity to the situation here.
So are you acknowledging there that the guidance note referring to HDU, there was some ambiguity attached to that.
With hindsight, I would say that now. At the time, we adopted it because we didn't want to basically rock the boat too much, because it didn't really have that much of an impact on what we were designing.
Okay. And on that room function reference sheet, if we look at the bedroom entry, which is the second entry in the list, you see that there?
Yes.
The bedroom room, if you look down the left-hand column, there's a room function for bedroom.
Yep.
And then if we read along that line, we eventually get to a column which is headed up relative pressure. You see that?
Now could you open that up for me a wee bit? It's just...
Yeah, we maybe need to zoom in a little bit.
Yes, I do, aye.
Yeah,
Yep.
you see that
It
column?
says balanced.
It says balanced.
Yep.
And was that a change introduced by Wallace Whittle?
Yes, as a result of, so that it correlated to the note 26 or whatever, and the discussions that we'd had on the strategy.
And if we don't need to do it, but if we looked at the version of the matrix circulated by the board with the tender documents, what it said in that box instead of balanced was positive. And that change was made so that pressure arrangements were consistent with what SHTM 0301 required for standard single bedrooms. I
would say that the change was made so that it was consistent with what the infection control required their systems to be operating at. It was through that discussion with them and representatives from the board's technical advisors that we arrived at that solution.
But it also happens to be consistent with what table A1
yes, it does. It does. But I would say, as I say, that's there. But the primary reason for us changing it was to address that comment that had been made and health infections concerns.
The effect of it was simply to bring the pressure arrangements for single bedrooms into line with what table A1 of SHTM 0301 recommended.
That's what it did, yeah.
And in line with your description of the way this sheet works, a change made here, for example, in relation to the pressure arrangements, would be replicated through the room-by-room part of the matrix.
Yes.
For any room that has the
any
particular
room with that
function.
title and basically, if you went to a bathroom, then if you go down to the environmental matrix, the bathrooms should all be there. So it takes an awful lot of the compilation potential for error away, as well as allowing people to have an overview of the more general rooms.
So on the particular change that we were talking about there, for the bedroom room function, change of that relative pressure from positive to balanced, that would be replicated throughout any room in the following part of the matrix, which was given the room function of bedroom.
Should have been, yes.
Yeah. If we go to page 226, please. Now, this is a bit tricky to achieve two things, which is to get the whole of the thing on the screen, but also to have it readable. If we zoom in a little bit so that we can see the left-hand column, the bottom part of it, please. Yeah, so if you just stop there, that's fine, thank you. Now, this is the part of the matrix which deals with things, first of all, on a department-by-department basis, and within departments on a room-by-room basis. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And we see here in the left-hand column the code B1. See that?
Yes, see that, yes.
Yeah, you understand that to be the critical care department.
Yes.
So what we should expect to see here is that for any rooms within this department designated with the room function of bedroom, the pressure will have been changed from positive to balanced. Is that correct?
That's what I'm expecting to see, yes.
Yeah. And that's simply a consequence of the change having been made in the room function reference sheet.
Yes.
So the effect is that for these rooms in critical care, the pressure requirement has been changed from positive to balanced.
Yes.
Yep. Now, if I was to put to you that that change is inconsistent with what SHTM 0301 requires for rooms in critical care, what's your answer to that?
I don't believe that's the correct interpretation of SHTM 0301.
And is that on the basis that the line in Table A1 for critical care, in your view, applies only to isolation rooms and not?
No, it's in line with what we spoke about this morning, which was the clinical output spec as well, which is the bespoke and considered environmental guide as part of that for the critical care area, whereby there is no other reference that I can find to pressurised rooms being required for other than the isolation rooms. I have also checked every other document that I can find which references this type of accommodation and cannot locate any a pressurised room being other than isolation rooms being required. Mm-hmm. So it's on that basis we're reviewing this.
Okay, I won't ask you to repeat your evidence about those matters because I think we covered that clearly this morning. But just to be clear, in your view, the entries on this page for bedrooms in critical care, which say the pressure arrangements should be balanced, in your view, for those reasons, is not inconsistent with SHTM 0301.
Absolutely. And I think you also have to reflect that within the critical care, there are single bedrooms which are not designated as isolation rooms, as well as the 4-bed wards that the focus has been on.
If we bear with me a second. So just by way of example, this is quite tricky given the scale of the document. But if you look down, which is the third column that you see on screen there, if you read down from the top, you see if you go down 2 or 3 entries, you see an entry for single bed isolation cubicle.
Oh, from the top? Yes, I do.
And if you read along, you then get to a column which describes it as an isolation bedroom. Yes. And then carrying on all the way along, we eventually come to a box that says 10. See that? Now, for fear of disrupting things, I won't ask for the document controller to move that. But if you take it from me, that column is headed up supply air changes per hour.
Yeah.
So what we see there is a parameter of 10 air changes per hour specified for something described as an isolation cubicle.
Yes.
And that reflects your evidence, I think, that that's where you would expect to see 10 air changes per hour. Yeah,
because the next entry in there is what they're referred to as a gowning lobby, and that is the method by which you give the pressurisation and introduce the air to an isolation room. An isolation room sitting as a box, you then have an entranceway, which is a gowning lobby, which acts basically like an air barrier. So the air is supplied into that gowning lobby, spills into the room, but also if you open the door from the corridor into the lobby, the air spills back out to the corridor, thus protecting the people or isolating, if you like, the people within the bedroom.
So that's the treatment of isolation facilities.
Yep.
And going back to that third column from the left, if we carry down a little bit to the fifth line, we see their single bed cubicle. See that?
Yes.
And then reading along, we see that that's given the room function of bedroom.
Yeah.
And then carrying on all the way along, we see that it's got a pressure arrangement of balanced. You see that?
And 4 air changes, yes.
And 4 air changes. And is that because, having been given the room function of bedroom, that particular room will reflect whatever parameters are put into the room function reference sheet for a room of that type?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And while we're here, if we look at the entry below that for open plan bay, that's just the one
4
below.
beds, yeah.
4 beds. And we read along, we see that it's been given the room function of multi-bed ward.
Yeah.
And then if we carry on along, we see that it's got a pressure arrangement of positive to ensuite.
Yes.
So that's been left unchanged from the board's version.
Yes. Because
why was that left unchanged?
At that point in time, there had been no review nor any reference to the 4-bedded ward areas. They were brought up separately. Again, we'll touch on that in the next portion, but they weren't brought up until we were actually under construction.
So if we remember that list of issues raised by the board in October, and the one, number 7, that we looked at concerning pressure arrangements, you understood that to refer only to single bedrooms.
That was my understanding, and that was what we presented, and at no time do I recall anyone ever specifically taking exception or asking for further information on the 4-bed wards. And it was simply to do with the single bed wards.
And do I take it also that that issue about the pressure arrangements for single bedrooms having been raised didn't prompt any reflection or consideration within your team about the pressure arrangements for the multi-bed?
Not at that particular point in time.
Not at that time.
No.
This is maybe a difficult question to answer, but do you recall in the period prior to financial close, if you were aware that the matrix referred to, in the guidance notes, 10 air changes per hour for critical care, but only 4 air changes per hour for these bedded areas in critical care? Was that something you were consciously aware of at that time?
No, because as I say, the critical care 10 air changes would, in our opinion, have referred to the isolation rooms. The terminology might have been better, but that was what we were speaking about.
Now, apart from the entries in the environmental matrix itself, allocating 4 air changes per hour to these bedded areas in critical care, was there anything else you were aware of to confirm that the board had deliberately chosen that?
Not at that point in time. There was, I'm not going to get in front of myself, but there was a full review of every 4-bed ward in that hospital when we were under construction. So there was further dialogue, but not at the point in time that we're speaking about at the moment.
As some witnesses, but I think not you, have referred in this regard to a report by Hulley and Kirkwood about thermal comfort.
There was a thermal comfort, yes, report that was prepared. My interpretation was that was more supporting the strategy of the 4 air changes and the openable windows.
Well, we can have a look at it, and just as a preface before we look at it, as I understand it, those other witnesses have taken this report to support the view that 4 air changes per hour had been deliberately chosen for single rooms.
Yes, well, yeah. I think we couldn't find a definitive document anywhere that said we're going for 4 air changes, but the report that you're referring to records that it is 4 air changes in the energy, and it was primarily they were looking at overheating in the rooms and what influence the potential open or not open window would have on that. So that, to be frank, it had already been a done deal when they prepared that report.
Okay, if we just have a look at that report, it's bundle 4, page 184. So we see here from its title page, it's a Hulley and Kirkwood document.
Yep.
It's got their logo on it. It's headed up Royal Hospital and so on, ward room thermal comfort analysis, and it's dated February 2012. Was this one of the documents available to you through the tender procedure so far as you can recall?
Yes, that document would have constituted part of the reference design suite of information which we received.
So were you familiar with that at the time, during the tender?
Yes, I'd read through it, yes.
To ask you this specific question, do you consider this report to offer any support for having 4 air changes per hour specifically in critical care rooms?
I don't think it touches on that from memory from reading it.
And if we go to page 188, you see the opening words there under the heading of introduction. This study has been prepared by Jonathan Macmillan, so on. The purpose of this study is to determine peak annual internal temperature profiles, typical single wardroom accommodation. So we see there it's a reference to it applying to typical single ward rooms. And then it carries on, for the reference design stage envisaged solution of providing wardrooms with mechanical ventilation and comfort cooled air. And under the heading of executive summary, it says, the profiles in simulations 1 and 2 show that the internal temperatures in wardrooms can be maintained at comfortable levels with 4 air changes per hour, so on.
Yeah.
There's a reference there to temperatures in summertime being controlled between 22 and 25 degrees centigrade. So is this, as you understood it, is this report essentially about temperature control?
That's exactly what this report is, in my opinion. It's not about ventilation. The concern was to demonstrate that you could keep the building at comfortable levels, A, with 4 air changes per hour, and B, that the influence of the openable windows was negligible, to address any concerns that if you opened the window in a sunny May day, not like today, and you get 30 degrees or whatever external, that it could impact on that, then that's what I believe that report was doing. Mm-hmm. We also carried out an overheating analysis of the building as part of our detailed design further down the line.
Mm-hmm. And in carrying out these temperature calculations, it proceeds on the assumption that 4 air changes per hour would be used.
Yes.
And if we go to page 194, please. What the report says here, just picking up halfway through that paragraph, says that a selection of rooms has been chosen to represent the likely worst case combination of exposure to solar gain, density of occupation, provision of mechanically supplied cooled air. That's on the basis that those are factors which would tend to have the biggest impact on temperature, pushing it up. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah.
Reading on, as such, critical care and high dependency type ward rooms, which receive air change rates in the region of 10 air changes per hour, have not been analysed in this study. So, in other words, whatever conclusion is drawn from this report is not intended to say anything about rooms in critical care or high dependency. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with your interpretation. I would agree with what's been put down there, which is that they restricted their studies to the more common rooms of the single rooms. But I don't read into that they are excluding single rooms within critical care. I really don't read that in that. It's because it doesn't say it.
Well, it does refer to those rooms getting air change rates of 10
air changes, yes. Which, again, in my experience and in the interpretation of the documents, would refer to the isolation rooms, which are an entirely different style of engineering that's involved with them.
Okay. And you refer in your statement, and I think you also said a couple of moments ago, to Hulley and Kirkwood having carried out energy use calculations on the assumption of 4 air changes per hour. Did I understand you correctly?
Carried out energy, there was basic energy consumption figures that had been calculated, but we also carried out our own predictions on or put it through our sustainability calculations. They don't tend to be. There's 2 levels here. One you've got to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations, and then there are also for BREEAM, there are one of the figures which influences that is your predicted. Not predict. That's the wrong word to use. Is your energy calculations. Now, having looked into that, the methodology of doing that, certainly in their own case, didn't directly relate to the air change rates. What it does do is a comparator, a software comparator, which has standard templates, which are applied to different wards, etc. And they then do a comparator to see if you are within the parameters that they expected of them. There is a separate exercise which is called a predicted study, and that sits outside of, I believe, what we were speaking about. I'm a wee bit hesitant there, to be frank with you, because it's normally handled by my sustainability experts, because it's quite a complex subject. And I know a bit about it, but I don't profess to be an expert.
Okay, I mean, it may be you can't answer this question, but at the highest level and in the most general terms, were any of the energy calculations based on an assumption that there would be 4 air changes per hour in the single bedrooms?
I don't think there was.
No. Okay. So, just trying to draw all of that together, apart from the environmental matrix itself stating that 4 air changes per hour were wanted in critical care rooms, was there any other information, as far as you're aware, to suggest that the board had made a conscious choice to have 4 air changes per hour in critical care?
No, I'm not aware of anything else. As I say, there was nothing to the contrary within their clinical output specification, which was probably the other key part of that briefing pack.
And I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll put it to you anyway, that you say in your statement at paragraph 29, we don't need it on screen, but for the record, the page reference to that paragraph is bundle 13, page 421. You say that you didn't see anything special about the critical care 4-bed wards, which would have suggested to me as an engineer that these were technically different from the other 4-bed wards. And if I could just put to you, the mere fact that these rooms were in the critical care department was not, in your view, enough to distinguish them from other such rooms in the hospital.
There was nothing within the geometry of those rooms, or indeed the finishes which were applied to those rooms, which would have led me to believe that they were to be treated as pressurised rooms. And I know for a fact that that wasn't the case on site. There was no solid ceilings, there was no pressure resistant light fittings. So
Okay, if we could go please to bundle 4, page 245. We see here an email from Graham Greer of Malt MacDonald to various people. I think you can see in amongst all the redactions, your name is in there. Emails dated the 11th of November.
yeah, see me, yeah.
See you there, yep.
Yep.
11th of November 2014, and Mr. Greer says, notes attached from today's meeting. And if we just scroll down to the next page, sorry, it may be the page after that. These appear to be the notes circulated by Mr. Greer. Do you just take a moment to look at that and tell me if you recognise it?
I don't honestly recall it, but I think it's fact that I've received it.
Okay. Mr. Greer in his email had referred to a meeting on the 11th of November 2014 from which that was the output. When you see what's listed there, do you remember the meeting?
No, I don't remember the particular meeting, but reading what you've put in front of me there, I would say that was part of the commentary which we'd taken on board, and when we were updating the matrix.
Okay, what we do see here is that there are broadly 7 points on that list, and there had been 11 or 12 on the note following the meeting in October. Was there any significance in that?
No, there was so many comments made on that environmental matrix. It's hard for me to put that into chronological in my head dates. We had assumed that if we took on board the board's comments on the matrix and updated it, then that document would then have moved forward. The reality was that wasn't the end of the process.
One point which appeared on the October list but doesn't appear on this list from November is the point about 6 air changes in bedrooms rather than 4. And I just wondered, was that because that particular issue was seen as having been resolved?
To be frank, it depends on the date of that and the date of the meeting that we had with the board and infection control and the Malt MacDonald's people.
And one of the points that we see on this list emerging from the November meeting, 4 bullet points up from the bottom, says detailed proposal awaited on bedroom ventilation to achieve balanced / negative pressure relative to the corridor. That perhaps indicates that particular issue
Sounds as if it was live at the time, yeah.
Still remain live,
Yeah.
hadn't been resolved at that point. And you can take it from me that those bullet points appear more or less word for word in one of the schedules to the project agreement, being the one setting out the reviewable design data. Is that something that you'll be familiar with?
Not particularly. That would have went direct to IHSL, like multiplex, and if there was comments, it would have flown through. It would have followed through to ourselves.
I mean, can you recall if the list of points there were incorporated into the reviewable design data schedule, that perhaps indicates they hadn't been resolved by financial close? Does that accord with your recollection?
No, the financial close, my understanding was that we were advised that the building services information in total was to be part of the RDD. The fact that the environmental matrix became part of that RDD process hadn't registered with myself or my team at that point in time.
So just to be clear about that, your understanding was that the building services information in its entirety was to be reviewable design data. Is that what you said?
Yes, and by that I mean the ventilation solutions, the actual physical detailed design drawings and specifications that we would normally prepare. Not necessarily the matrix.
You didn't understand the matrix. I mean, did I understand from what you said a moment ago that process of finalising the project agreement and what was in it, that was carried out by people other than you, and it wasn't a process you were involved in?
No, I don't recall being involved in it at all. I recall being told just that we had to resubmit all of the detailed design was going into RDD, which didn't particularly surprise me because it was probably a good place for it to go anyway.
And so was that, I mean, it makes sense, but that process handled by Multiplex or IHSL in their negotiations with the board?
It was probably a combination of the two of them. I wasn't party to those discussions.
Okay. If we could look please at bundle 8, page 64. See down at the bottom there an email from Leanne Edwards Scott, who I think was from Multiplex.
Yes, yes.
And it's sent to Ken Hall, also of Multiplex, 19th November 2014. MOTS have just informed the HAI scribe that the vent system doesn't comply with infection control because it relies on the windows being openable. Can you shed some light or offer opinion? And then if we scroll up to read the email above, please, so go on to page 63. We see at the bottom of the page, Mr. Hall forwards the email to you the same day. It says, "Hi Stewart, can you treat as priority the bedroom sketches for the vent before the door closes? And we have no alternative but to comply with infection control requirements. Realistically, I think we need 1, interpretation of SHTM for bedrooms, 2, airflow movement under a few scenarios, natural vent, etc. And then if you go down the page, please, 3, and how this impacts on the adjacent corridor ventilation."
Yep.
So on.
And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah, so was this the issue about the pressure in the bedrooms?
Absolutely.
And Mr. Hall, in forwarding on to you, said we've got no alternative but to comply with the infection control requirements. Do you agree with that?
I would disagree with his terminology that the 6-year changes was a requirement. My agreement would be on the fact that where he says realistically, I think we need 1 interpretation of the SHTM for the bedrooms and airflow movement under a few scenarios. That was what we took on board and presented to the board.
Yeah, so when he asked you to interpret SHTM for bedrooms, what did you take that to mean?
I took it to mean that they were looking for an overview of which was exactly what we gave them, of what the SHTM recommendations were, and then to give them airflow movement under a few scenarios, which was what would happen if it was a purely natural event, what would happen if it was what they were looking at as briefed, which is what I did with them.
And did you recognise that you were dealing here with an infection control issue?
I recognised that the query had been raised by infection control, yes.
And when Mr. Hall asked you to interpret SHTM for bedrooms in that particular context, did it occur to you that the significance of air pressure for infection control might be different for critical care bedrooms than for normal bedrooms?
No, because that, again, at that particular stage, I do not recall there being any differential being applied to any department, be it critical care or any other department within the hospital. This was, as far as I could see, an across-the-board solution for single bedrooms.
And you've already explained your understanding that any different pressure requirements established by guidance, critical control would relate only to isolation rooms.
Yes.
And just following on from Mr. Hall's email, there's an email above from you, which I think is probably circulated within your team at Wallace Whittle, and I think probably intended in a humorous tone. Told you wouldn't wait until RDD and so on.
Yeah.
What were you referring to there?
There had been discussions between ourselves and Ken about the interpretation of the bedrooms, and at that time I felt it was getting put on ice, and I didn't want it put on ice. I wanted to get it out and get it resolved because, as explained, these are critical for me to then start to fulfil my duties as a designer. And I didn't want anything to go into RDD, which was a basic design parameter.
And specifically, what issue was it that you wanted resolved before?
The ventilation rates to the bedrooms. If it was going to change to 6 air changes, then I had to brief my engineers to tell them that the figures that they were going to use in the preparation of the detailed design was 6 air changes, or whatever figure it was going to be.
Just so I can be clear about it, were there two issues that you wanted resolved? The number of air changes for single bedrooms, but also the pressure arrangements relative to the corridor?
It was the ventilation, it was the balance between the two of them. So the discussions that we had encompassed the pressure and the extent of the air changes that we're speaking about. That information is absolutely critical to me to move on to designing a bedroom system.
And was this a concern in your mind, the need to resolve all of this? Did that arise following the board's comments in October, raising the query on these particular issues, or was it something that you'd been concerned about before then?
No, it arose after the concerns were first flagged up, where there was then appeared to be, let's call it a change of mind from the briefing, which I was wanting to get resolved.
Okay, and in January 2015, Wallace Whittle prepared an air movement report. And if we just go to that, please. It's at Bundle 8, page 66. Do you recall this report?
Absolutely, yes. Yep.
And just, could you explain to us an overview, purpose of this report and what in your view it established?
And the purpose of the report was to play back to the client group what they had briefed they wanted the ventilation figures to be. To help them understand that, we also gave them the guidance on what the SHTMO3 gave in the Table 1. And then we played through various scenarios in order that we addressed their concerns, which was the particular concern raised was this question of the pressure relationship between the bedroom and the adjacent corridor.
And
They had briefed it as positive, but iScribe had then taken the view that it would be better to be either negative or balanced. So we then looked at what we could do with the systems to achieve that in order that we could refine our design.
okay, and if we go forward to the conclusion at page 67, maybe ask you in your own words to explain what you understood the conclusion of the report to be.
Conclusion was that if they wanted to guarantee that they had a balanced system, and irrespective of the position of the windows, bearing in mind that the windows have I think it's 100mm restrictor on them, then the best way I could see of giving them that was to increase the extraction rate through the bathroom, such that we essentially took out of the room as much air as we were supplying into the bedroom. That then gave them a balanced condition.
I rather read the conclusion in the following way, that if positive pressure from the bedroom was to be avoided, then the windows or the trickle vents would have to be left open. Is that correct?
If they had left the system as it was then briefed with 10 air changes in the bathroom. So in order to negate what you're speaking about, our recommendation was that you could forget the windows impact. Because you can't guarantee whether they're going to be opened or closed, because it's at the discretion of staff and patients. Balance the two systems, and then you shouldn't have that concern.
And again, in line with what you've said so far, can we take it that this report, in preparing this report, you didn't apply any different considerations to rooms in the critical care department?
No, we didn't, no.
Now, if we could go to page 78 of Bundle 8, please. And again, you're not the sender or recipient of these emails, but I think you are copied in. And at the bottom, we see an email from Ken Hall to Maureen Brown of Mott MacDonald and Janice McKenzie of NHSL. And what he says is, as per meeting of Tuesday, 13 January 2015, and our request for clarity on negative stroke positive pressure regime within the bedrooms, we attached the sketches distributed at the meeting, seek confirmation acceptance from the NHS review of infection control. And just briefly, were those drawings that Wallace, or these sketches that Wallace Whittle had produced?
They would have been, yes.
Can you recall what they were intended to show, or what they did show?
They showed, from memory, they showed the direction of air travel under the various scenarios.
And this email...
I think they were taken from a presentation that I did on that report that we just looked at.
Okay. And we see that Mr. Hall's email requests confirmation or acceptance from the NHS with infection control.
Yep.
And then the reply from Mr. Hall above it, the 29th of January 2015, from Maureen Brown at Mott MacDonald. Hi Ken, following your recent request for information, the board respond as follows. Single room with ensuite ventilation design shall comply with the parameters set out in SHTM 0301. The design solution should not rely in any way with the opening windows. These will be opened or closed by patient choice. And the critical factor from SHTM 0301 for infection control will be the resultant pressure within the room being balanced with or negative to the corridor. And what did you take from that response?
The first 3 points there align exactly with what I've just spoken about, where the critical factor which came under discussion was the pressure. We had, within the report, we had excluded the impact of the opening windows because they were a variant with little or no effect, and the single room ventilation design shall comply with the parameters set out in SHTM 0301. That didn't, in my mind, trigger something that said it had to be all in accordance with the table, but rather with the recommendations of 0301, which the 4 air changes, in my opinion, accords with. So I believe that we had, and I think as did Ken, believe that we had addressed their concerns. The reference to the isolation room, it sits outside of the single rooms that we're speaking about. So it's those 3 points which are the critical ones in that response.
I mean, is it fair to take the board's response as simply saying, we want you to comply with SHTM 0301?
Yeah, you could have taken it in simplistic terms there and said, well, we rescind the direction we gave you in the briefing environmental matrix and make it comply with 0301, which in essence is what we did.
Okay, financial close occurred in February 2015. Project agreement concluded at that point. And I take what you said earlier about, I think as far as you recall, that wasn't a process that you were directly involved in.
No, the discussions, etc., we weren't involved with that whatsoever.
Yeah. Were you aware that and you may not be, and if not, just please say so, that in the project agreement there was a derogation from the obligation to comply with the environmental matrix?
No, it doesn't ring a bell, no.
You weren't aware of that?
No.
If I could ask you please to have a look at the paper. This is a document in the paper apart to bundle 5 at page, well, first of all, page 3836. Sorry, page 3836. Mr. McKechnie, these are the project company proposals from the project agreement. And were you aware that those proposals included a derogation register?
It doesn't resonate with me. Possibly because I think if we had any, there were very few derogations that we were looking for against the reference design.
Okay, well, if we could
so
go...
I can't read that. There may be something in there, but I certainly can't see it there.
Well, it's okay. We're going to go to a particular page, but this is just the register of all of the derogations. If we could go to page 3861, please. And if you can just zoom in on that so we can read it clearly, please. So we see this is headed up derogation request. The first box is the clause in the board construction requirements concerned with mechanical and electrical engineering requirements. You recall that's the one we looked at earlier on, which says that Project Co was to provide the works to comply with the environmental matrix. You recall that provision of the BCRs?
I recall that, yes.
Yeah. And if we read down, there's a box headed up derogation. Anomalies within the environmental matrix have been reviewed and proposals incorporated within the room data sheets refer to schedule for proposed variations. Having seen that now, do you recall this derogation?
I certainly don't, but it appears to be more, it seems to be more pointed at room data sheets, which we had very little input into at that particular point in time.
And insofar as this document refers to anomalies within the environmental matrix, are you able to cast any light on what that refers to?
No, I'm afraid that I haven't. We would have to ask the author of the room data sheets. Bearing in mind there was only that there wasn't a complete pack of room data sheets for the entire building until later on in the contract.
Bear with me, Mr. McKechnie.
Sure.
Now, you may not have been aware of that derogation, but you were aware, I think, that certain things relating to the mechanical and electrical engineering elements form part of the reviewable design data.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Were you involved in the decision about what was to be made part of the reviewable design data?
No, I don't believe so. Our focus was on the matrix.
And so did anybody ask you about the idea of having the environmental matrix as reviewable design data?
No, I don't recall that discussion at all, because I do find it strange.
So presumably you did become aware at some stage that the matrix had been included in the reviewable design data. And you said you were surprised by that. Can you just explain what you made of that decision and why you were surprised about it?
I was surprised on the basis that, I'm still surprised that you could consider a client brief or to go into contract with someone with a document which basically provided a performance standard and have it open-ended, that performance standard was going to be reviewed further down the line. That's contrary to my understanding of any employer's briefing document I'd seen before.
On the basis that until the client's brief is finalised, you don't know what you're contracting to provide?
From my own, yes, from my own point of view, until that client brief is formalised, I can't really pass go on preparing the detailed designs, which, given the point we were at the contract, were obviously the next stage of my design development.
Would it have been your expectation that the reviewable design data would be confined to project companies' proposals?
I was anticipating, once they said that the building services were to be classified as reviewable design, that my layout, excuse me a minute, my layout drawings and my detailed design proposals, which consisted basically of the drawings with the various departments and how we were going to engineer them, that is what I was anticipating would come through in RDD. And that was the bulk of RDD.
But once you became aware that the environmental matrix had been included in the RDD, what did you understand to be the extent of revisals that IHSL were to carry out to it?
What then transpired was that the environmental matrix then took on a life of its own, where it was commented upon by the client team on numerous occasions.
As you appreciate, and I think the shortness of your answer reveals that you do appreciate, I don't really want to get into what happened after financial close. It was just, what I'm interested in is your understanding, what you expected the revisals of the environmental
At that
matrix
point in time,
to be concerned with.
At that point in time, I was expecting potentially a one-hit to tidy the environmental matrix up to the agreement of all the parties, and then we would move forward. That was my expectation at that particular time.
And if I was to put it to you that the IHSL had the responsibility to review all of the ventilation parameters in the matrix and check them for compliance with SHTM 0301, does that reflect your understanding of the task or not?
No, what I'm referring to, if I've picked you up correctly, is that given the comments that we'd already received, which traced their life back to the matrix, was that there would have been normally another batch of comments which we would have reviewed, taken on board the revised environmental matrix, and then it should have been put in a drawer as the agreed brief to go forward.
Sorry, it's my fault. I lost concentration there. Could you just repeat that answer? The question was, I think Ms. McLean put to you that IHSL had the responsibility to review all the ventilation requirements. I think you then said no. What did you go on to say?
What my interpretation of what was to happen at that point in time would be that there would be another let's call it, say, another batch of comments on the matrix by the board, which we would then have addressed. And at that point, I would expect that we should have been able to finalise the matrix and close it down, and we then had a defined client's brief and design brief for my engineers to then take that on board and start to develop the detailed designs.
Thank you.
It's a fundamental step in any project.
Okay, if we could have, please, bundle 5, page 14. And this is the project agreement, Mr. McKechnie. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you what it means. That's a matter for the lawyers. But if you could just have a look at paragraph 7.3.1, and what it says there is that Project Co, so IHSL, acknowledges and confirms that it has conducted its own analysis and review of the disclosed data and has, before the execution of this agreement, satisfied itself as to the accuracy, completeness and fitness for purpose of any such disclosed data upon which it places reliance. Now, that clause refers to a category of information called disclosed data. If we just proceed on the basis that that includes the environmental matrix,
right?
To what extent, as far as you know, did IHSL carry out its own analysis and review of the environmental matrix and satisfy itself as to the accuracy, completeness, fitness for purpose of any of the information in it?
I can't obviously comment on what reviews IHSL had undertaken. I would expect that they had written that in mind with our own comments that we had. We did not have any particular queries on the environmental matrix as it stood at that time. That was demonstrated by the fact that it was the board that continually came back with queries and comments on the matrix, not ourselves.
It might be said that that clause means that if IHSL, by that I mean the whole IHSL consortium, elected to use the environmental matrix parameters that they received with the tender documents, they did so at their own risk, that it was fit for purpose. And to what extent did you consider that that was a risk that the contractor team had taken on?
I didn't see the risk in that. I saw the risk in the client coming back and asking for alternative, as it transpired, alternative solutions to the briefed environmental matrix.
Okay. The project agreement at financial close included room data sheets for generic and key rooms. Were you aware of that?
I was aware of it towards the end of the process.
And these included room data sheets for what I'm going to refer to loosely as the bedded areas in critical care. And consistent with the environmental matrix, they show 4 air changes per hour for those rooms. Again, is that something that you were aware of? Had you seen these room data sheets?
I don't recall seeing the room data sheets, given the fact that we were all pulling separately to get the overall package together. But it doesn't surprise me that they said the 4, because that's what they would have taken, or the architect who was compiling these would have taken from the matrix.
So do you know who it was that put the room data sheets together?
It was the architect, HLM.
And does that include the elements, the environmental parameter pages of the room data sheet?
Yes, I believe it did, yes.
Do you know by what process they put the room data sheets together?
I don't, sorry.
Do you know if they started with an output from the activity database?
I'm sorry, I really don't know how they pulled them together, whether they took the ADB sheets and revised them. I suspect that's the case, but I really don't know.
And do you happen to know that if they had taken sheets from the activity database, if they would have been pre-populated with an air change figure?
I really couldn't comment, because the downloading the ADB sheets is not something that, as a practice, we would normally do.
Now, the board's position, as I understand it, is that there was an error in the environmental matrix which made it non-compliant with the guidance. And I appreciate you disagree with that view.
I don't disagree with the statement that there was an error. I don't necessarily understand what that error was. So when they said there was an error, was it an error that they had briefed Hull and Kirkwood to go for a particular figure, which didn't transpire and then continue its life onto the reference design environmental matrix? So I'm not trying to evade the question there, but it's that the terminology used is a bit too vague for me to tie that down. Yeah. I don't see the error as such against the SHTMs or their guidance.
I probably put the questions very badly. I think you would accept that the environmental matrix was at the root of difficulties on this project, if I could put it that way. Do you agree with that?
It was, yeah, I would agree that it was one of a number of things which seemed to take a lifetime to resolve, yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, and maybe this question's difficult to answer if we don't have a precise agreement about what the issue with it was, but I was just going to put to you, in relation to the use of environmental matrices, is there anything that you could say in hindsight might have helped those problems be avoided?
In this particular instance, in fact, in any instance, I think that it would have been useful if there had been a design strategy statement prepared which helped define the parameters which had been part and parcel of discussions between the original reference designer and whomsoever it was that helped them compile the environmental matrix. And I'm speaking from experience, it would be, in my opinion, it would be normal as a designer to play back to a client what I felt they had agreed to in order that I could then move forward. I didn't see any of that. It may exist. I'm absolutely not saying it doesn't exist, but I don't recall that we were ever privy to seeing that, and that would have assisted.
I mean, are you really saying there it would be helpful to know what was in the mind of the person who created the environmental matrix?
Well, that would. Well, I see that as a stage before you prepare an environmental matrix that you would have. And again, from experience, you would tend to have general conversations with the clinicians, if appropriate, and the engineering staff when you were developing the strategy. At that point in time, I would normally play back that strategy to the other side of the room and say, look, have I interpreted what you're speaking about correctly? Let's just get that bottomed out in case you've misheard or the change of opinion. And that, I think, would have been very useful.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, just trying to make sure I've understood it. Is that another way of saying that it would have been helpful for you performing your role to have had access to the end user of the ventilation system? Or to have had some document recording?
At the point in time and with the, under the circumstances of trying to assist somebody essentially pull a tender together, it's not really that practical to have that degree of involvement, bearing in mind that you're in a competitive situation, so it's not just your own group that would have to have that. The other tenderers or whatever would also need that same access, which is pretty impossible to achieve.
Okay, Mr. McKechnie, thank you very much. I don't have any more questions for you at this stage, but it's usually an opportunity for others to indicate if they may have questions. So you just stay there for the moment.
Okay.
Mr. McLeod, what we have done earlier in the week, as you're aware, is break for about 10 minutes just to check that nothing has arisen and allow the witness to be in the witness room for that period. I take it same consideration.
Yes, content to proceed in that way.
Ms. McKechnie, you may have no more questions to
I won't run away.
to answer, rather, but if you would allow us another 10 minutes, then you'll be taken to the witness room.
Please stand.
Mr. McLellan.
Thank you, my lord. I'm grateful to Mr. Mackenzie on behalf of Multiplex for suggesting essentially a short clarification, which I'm content to put to the witness.
Right. Mr. McKechnie, I think just one further question.
Yep,
will
no
be
problem.
asked by Mr. McClelland. Mr. McClelland.
Thank you for coming back, Mr. McKechnie. This will be brief, I hope. Could I ask you just to clarify your understanding of the extent to which, at financial close, the environmental matrix was reviewable design data? But in particular, did you understand it to be reviewable design data in its entirety, or only to the limited extent of comments that the board had made?
My understanding, I'll be speaking about, I need clarification, I'll be speaking about the point where the environmental matrix moved into RDD territory, or are we speaking about the point earlier on in that process?
Specifically at financial close, when the project agreement is concluded, at that point in time.
At that point in time,
Yep.
I did not personally understand that environmental matrix was to be classified as reviewable design data at all.
At all.
You weren't aware of that at financial close?
No.
And at the risk of breaching my own stricture of not asking about the period after financial close, do you recall when you did become aware that the environmental matrix had become reviewable design data?
Just as part and parcel of the discussions that we then started in the reviewable design data with the client's technical advisors.
Okay. Well, in that case, I have no further questions for you, Mr. McKechnie.
You sure?
I think I'm sure.
Right. I think you're entitled to hold him to that, Mr. McKechnie. Can I, before allowing you to leave, can I say thank you? Thank you for attending today and giving evidence over quite a long time, which is an arduous thing to do. But more arduous is the preparation that you will have done in order to put yourself in a position to give evidence. And I'm particularly grateful for that. So with my thanks, I'll
Thank you.
invite you to
All the help.
leave us.
Right. Right.
Mr. McClelland, I think the plan is to hear from Mr. Cooper.
Yes, indeed, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cooper. I suspect you've been waiting for longer than you had anticipated. And I apologize for that to the extent that you've had to be kept waiting. But as you perhaps would anticipate, it's not always possible to predict precisely or even broadly how long a witness will take. Now, I understand you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McClelland, but I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes, I am.
Just remain seated where you are, raise your right hand, and repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Could I ask you please just to confirm your name?
My name's Paul Cooper.
And have you supplied the inquiry with a witness statement, Mr. Cooper?
I have, yes.
And do you have a copy of it sitting there in front of you?
I do.
And for the benefit of those using the electronic resources, the reference is bundle 13 at page 312. And does that statement set out fully and truthfully your evidence on the matters it addresses?
It does.
And is there anything in it that you think needs to be changed or corrected?
No.
Well, the inquiry will accept that statement as your evidence, but I've got a few more questions to put to you today. Just by way of introduction, you're an electrical engineer with Wallace Whittle, is that correct?
I am, yes.
And your statement says that you qualified in 2003 and you've been with Wallace Whittle since 2015.
That's correct, albeit it was Tuv Sud Wallace Whittle at that point.
Yes, thank you. That's something that we clarified with Mr. McKechnie earlier. So your experience and skills lie in electrical engineering rather than mechanical engineering, is that correct?
That's correct.
And just to be clear about it, to what extent is it within your knowledge or expertise to comment on ventilation systems?
I can speak very broadly and at very high level on ventilation systems, as I would sometimes have to engage with a client or a user on that, but I couldn't detail or design a ventilation system.
When it comes to the design of a ventilation system or its compliance with standards and so on, is that something on which you would defer to your mechanical engineering colleagues?
It is, yes.
So you explain in your statement that you joined the Sick Kids project in January 2015. That would be about a month or so before financial close.
That was it, yes.
And that was to work on the electrical design.
Yes, it was.
And to what extent were the electrical designers and the mechanical designers, to what extent did they work in different teams?
When I joined Tuv Sud at that point, there was a dedicated Sick Kids team at that point, and we were working together. So the mechanical engineers and the electrical engineers were working together in the same space, but also together as a unit on the project.
Okay. Now, you refer in your statement to the environmental matrix. Was the environmental matrix relevant to your work on the electrical elements?
It was, yes. The first half of the environmental matrix was mostly mechanical, but the second half related to electrical items such as lighting levels or standby generator grades.
Okay. And in your statement, you describe the environmental matrix as the client briefing document and also as the key document. And you say that you understood it to be necessary to apply all of the parameters within it. Was that your understanding of it?
It was, yes.
And where did that understanding come from?
When I first joined the company, I spent a little bit of time pulling together, obviously, and understanding the project. As part of that understanding and research, the BCRs were a big part of what I looked through. The BCRs, within the definitions of the environmental matrix, noted that it was the client's briefing document that was to be adhered to. And there was also a separate section within the BCRs that said this too, or a separate paragraph, sorry. Mm-hmm. Also, as part of the bid, there was a number of questions that had to be answered. And one of those questions, I think, was C 8.3, which referred to the environmental matrix as a mandatory requirement. I don't know if mandatory was the word, but a requirement to be adhered to.
Mm. You referred there to the tender and the what was required by the board during the tender process. Do you recall that those documents referred to the environmental matrix as a draft?
I don't recall specifically noting that there was a draft environmental matrix, no.
And did you understand that there was scope for bidders to suggest changes to the matrix to any degree?
No, I didn't understand that. At the point I joined the project, the environmental matrix had obviously been reviewed, discussed, but I didn't realise that we could go back and make changes to it. In fact, in my head, I always felt it was discouraged to do that, as it was the client's document.
Now, you say in your head you felt it was discouraged to do that. Was Was that something you just assumed for yourself, or was that something that was discussed within the team?
It wasn't discussed specifically. It was something assumed just based on the BCRs and the way it's been presented as part of the BCRs.
To what extent had you, prior to the Sick Kids project, come across environmental matrices being used as briefing documents?
Very little before this. The environmental matrix, if used at that point, was generally maybe towards the middle of a project, and it was used to collate all the information together so that it could be reviewed easily when the designers were going through the design. But I think this might have been my first project that was given to me as a briefing document.
So on those earlier projects, when the matrices arose towards the middle of the project, how was the briefing carried out?
The briefing either came through authority construction requirements, board's construction requirements, or employers' requirements documents, and on occasion, if they were available, we'd be given room data sheets too, albeit that was quite rare at that stage.
Okay. And on those previous projects, had you come across a procuring authority setting out detailed mechanical and engineering parameters and giving that to the project company?
Not detailed room by room. There was detailed parameters within the various documents I mentioned earlier, such as BCRs and ERs, but not on a room by room basis, no.
So can we take it from that then that the extent to which the environmental matrix on the Sick Kids project had specific parameters on a room by room basis, did that go beyond, in terms of its detail, what you would normally receive at the briefing stage?
It probably did go beyond what would be expected to see at that stage, albeit it would have to be received at some point, whether that be through room data sheets, but at that particular stage it was probably beyond what we would usually expect.
Okay. And if a document is provided to you as a designer, as a briefing document, is there a normal practice about the extent to which you would check it for compliance with guidance, or is that something that depends on the contract?
It would depend on the situation. With an environmental matrix, we would certainly review it, perhaps not on a line-by-line basis at that point, given that the design wasn't being carried out, but there would certainly be a review of the document to make sure that there was no glaring errors within it.
Now, I appreciate we're talking in sort of generalities and hypotheticals, but are you able to give us an indication of the sort of thing you have in mind when you're referring to a glaring error?
Speaking from the electrical side, for instance, if the generation, if the scope of the standby generation hadn't been covered in areas that we would expect to see it covered, in critical areas such as a theatre, for instance, then that's the sort of thing that would jump out. Or perhaps the illumination levels noted might be much lower than would be expected, and that would jump out to me too.
You said a moment ago that you weren't aware that the environmental matrix had been described in the board's tender documents as a draft. If you had been aware of that, would that have altered your approach to it?
No, I don't think it would. I think, in my mind, I would have probably looked at that as it was a draft that had to be further populated at a later date with additional rooms and the like. But I wouldn't have taken that to mean that some of the fundamental structure of the environmental matrix had to be changed.
So even if it had been described as a draft, you would have, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but just I'm trying to make sure I've understood what you said. You would treat the given parameters in it as something that you had to comply with?
Yes, I think I would.
The label of draft wouldn't change your view of that?
No.
You refer in your statement to Wallace Whittle submitting the environmental matrix as a rebranded Wallace-Whittle document in October 2014. Now, I'm conscious that that was a time before you were involved in the project. What's your knowledge of that based upon?
The knowledge of that is based upon the fact that it was circulated and it was available on the common data environment at that point.
And what was your understanding of the significance of Wallace-Whittle having issued the environmental matrix as their own document?
I didn't believe there was any significance in that. It seemed, for reasons unknown, that it had to be submitted as part of the bidding team's pack of information for financial close or full business case. And it seemed a technicality that it just had to be rebranded as a TÜV-SÜD document and issued.
Did the fact that it was being reissued as a Wallace-Whittle document indicate to you in any way that it had been taken on from that point as a contractor's proposal to meet the board's requirements?
It would have been submitted as part of the project co-proposals, so I suppose, yes, it was part of the PCPs at that time, but I didn't take it to mean that it was now in our gift to change things within that document.
Now, you say in your statement that you can't comment on whether Wallace-Whittle reviewed the ventilation parameters for compliance with SHTMs, but the environmental matrix includes certain electrical parameters. Were those electrical parameters checked for compliance with applicable guidance?
They were checked by me and my team, but not initially as part of that January, February time. They were checked when we went through the design of the building. So we designed it on a room-by-room basis at that point, and the environmental matrix sat next to us and we reviewed it at that point.
Okay, now I've been clear with other witnesses that I'm not going to ask questions about that period after financial close, so I will not follow that up at this point. To what extent, if any, did you, and we're talking here about the period up to financial close, to what extent, if any, did you regard Wallace-Whittle as having scope to suggest changes to the parameters in the environmental matrix?
Whilst I didn't think it was within our gift just to unilaterally make changes, if we'd have saw something that we felt needed changed, I certainly thought we could have raised that via RFI or TQ to Multiplex at the time.
And just for the record, explain what you mean by RFI or TQ.
So requests for information or a technical query, these are official documents that could be raised, quick questions essentially, that would be done in a written format and request a response from the board via Multiplex.
And in what circumstances would you envisage those being things that you might do in relation to parameters which the board had set out in the document?
Probably to do with the point I made earlier about glaring errors. I don't think I would make it for something that I thought was one interpretation or the other, but if I thought something was truly just wrong, I think that's the situation I'd have raised it.
Mm. And would you include within wrong something that stood out as inconsistent with relevant guidance?
Yes, if something was inconsistent with the guidance I was aware of, yes, that would be wrong, in my opinion, at that time, or would certainly require to be clarified.
Your statement refers to the environmental matrix as missing certain electrical information. How did that come to your attention?
The main point I mentioned on that one was the categorisation and grouping of rooms, which is a requirement to carry out the electrical design. So very early on when we started to carry out that design, we realised there was a bit more information we needed and it wasn't included within the environmental matrix.
And is this something that came to your attention after financial close? Or was it before then?
It would probably have been after financial close. Certainly there was no action taken before financial close.
Now, you also say in your statement that environmental matrices are becoming more commonly used on projects. Is that right?
Very much so, yes.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's because room data sheets, as we're maybe all a bit more used to, are quite a bulky specimen. There's 3, 4, 5 pages for each individual room. When you multiply that through the building, it's quite difficult. There's probably only one page that's relevant to building services, and the rest of it's not particularly relevant. So the environmental matrix combines all that into one document where you can look at it on a line-by-line nature. So I think it's an ease of use factor.
Would you say there are any downsides or risks to using them?
The environmental matrix is done manually. So I suppose, as with anything, human error would potentially come into it. So if someone put the wrong information into a cell, then that's certainly a risk on an environmental matrix.
And are you aware of any ways in which the prospect of human error can be managed or eradicated?
A robust checking process is the only way that I could see it. I don't think there's any automated way that that could be alleviated within an environmental matrix.
Now, are you aware of Scottish Government directions to health boards requiring the use of the activity database as a briefing tool?
I'm aware of that now, but I wasn't aware of that before financial close.
Do you have any views on activity database as a briefing tool?
I think the activity database that then forms the basis of the room data sheets is a good briefing tool if you can get it at the right time. But it's very, very unlikely that any board would be in a position to give you all the room data sheets for any given building at the time that we were looking for them. So I think it's a good idea in concept, but I don't think it would be able to be pulled together in time for a design.
And is that simply because the activity database provides data on a room-by-room basis, so in order to use it you need to know first what rooms you're going to have?
Well, there's a little bit of that, but there's also the fact that the room data sheets are primarily architecturally focused, and there's a lot of information that the architect will need to get from the client, the user group meetings as they're called, and that can take multiple iterations and months of work to pull that together. So it's not something, until you know the full structure of your building and how it's going to be used, it's not something you could pull together.
And do I take it from your answer there that for any particular building there's a process that has to be gone through which would allow you to go from whatever the activity database specifies for a given room, turn it into a particular specification for the particular hospital?
Yes, so should caveat, I've never actually used the activity database myself, it's always architecturally done, but essentially it gives out standard information that then does have to be populated or addressed by the architect and the client's team to make it bespoke to that hospital.
You also refer in your statement to, I think you used the phrase, an attitude shift towards SHTM guidance. And what I've understood you to mean is that people now view it less as an advisory matter, which they might have done before, and more as a fundamental requirement. Could you just expand on what you mean by that, please?
The SHTMs have always been good documents, but they have been advisory, and there have been areas within them that have not always been as clear as they might be. So people perhaps have been pragmatic in their view of them. Sometimes they have suggested derogations or changes to the SHTMs that a client would be willing to accept. In fact, a client might encourage on occasion. Now, with some of what's happened over the last few years, frankly, that risk of going away from the guidance is not something people are willing to take on as much anymore. So we're seeing them very much now taken as a de facto, not a guide, but certainly as something that should be adhered to.
Now, in what you described there as the previous approach, would we understand the professionals, the designers, to be bringing to bear some professional expertise and judgment in the design? In other words, taking the guidance as guidance, but then using their own professional judgment to decide on the final design.
There would be certainly a part of that. The engineers that would be involved in healthcare work are generally quite experienced and have carried out a lot of healthcare before it, so they know what works and what doesn't. But also included in that would be the client's view on how they want their particular hospital to run, and sometimes that might require, or might have done in the past, require changes to the SHTM.
Mm-hmm. So under the new approach that you've described, is there less of that professional judgment and exploration of options with the client in deference to what's specified in the guidance?
There's less of it. It still happens. We still have derogations on any healthcare project that we work on, but it probably happens less than it ever did, yes.
And do you have a view as a professional person about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing if it encourages the SHTMs to adapt and improve, which I think they actually are doing. I think it's times and places, I suppose. At that time with the SHTMs that we had, that was probably the right thing to do. Now, as things change and SHTMs get updated and experience changes, I think the less pragmatic approach is probably the right way to go now.
Okay, Mr. Cooper, those are the only questions I've got for you today, and I'm sorry you've waited probably most of the day for such a short period of questioning. It's possible that some other people may have questions, so Lord Brodie may ask you to leave the room for a short while.
Yes, Mr. Cooper, if we can test your patience just a little further. You'll be taken back to the witness room, and in 10 minutes, I'll ask you to come back, or I'll ask someone to ask you to come back, and we'll find out if there's any further questions.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, 10 minutes may not be necessary,
No,
but I'll be at hand.
Please stand.
Now, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, my lord. I'm happy to report there are no further questions for Mr. Cooper.
Right. Could Mr. Cooper come in, please? Mr. Cooper, there will be no further questions, but before you leave, as you're now free to do, can I thank you for waiting patiently, for giving evidence, but also for preparing to give evidence, which I appreciate is a significant task. So thank you for all of these elements in your attendance, but you're now free to go and will be taken from the inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I think the plan is to sit at 9:30 tomorrow. Is that right? When perhaps Mr. McGregor will be in the chair. Is that right? Or are you taking questions tomorrow?
Both Mr. McGregor and I are taking questions tomorrow. Right. For the time being, I can't remember the precise sequence, but you will see us both.
Very well. Well, good afternoon to everyone, and we'll see each other all being well tomorrow.
Please stand.